October 12, 2019. Just before 3 in the morning, part of an 18-story building under construction at 1031 Canal Street in New Orleans collapses. The project is the Hard Rock Hotel, an $85 million construction effort. 3 workers are killed. Approximately 30 others are injured. This is not a natural disaster. This is not an act outside human control. This is a structure that was being designed, engineered, reviewed, and built by named companies operating under contract, on a budget, on a schedule. What follows in the months and years afterward is not a story about a single broken beam. It is a story about how a construction project's chain of technical sign-offs can fail quietly, long before the physical structure fails loudly. The Hard Rock Hotel collapse would eventually produce a federal safety investigation, more than $315,000 in regulatory fines, a municipal lawsuit seeking over $12 million in recovered costs, a 4-year criminal investigation, and ultimately, no criminal charges at all. Each of those outcomes traces back to decisions made on this job site, on this budget, under this timeline, at 1031 Canal Street. To understand how a nearly finished 18-story hotel partially collapsed in the middle of the night, we have to look at what was and was not verified before the steel ever went up. We have to look at who was responsible for checking the connections holding the building together, and what happened when that check did not happen the way it should have. This was a project with a name, a price tag, and a long list of companies attached to it. The collapse did not happen because something unforeseeable occurred. It happened because a specific, identifiable technical failure was allowed to stand. What comes next is the reconstruction of how that happened, and why, even years later, the people responsible were never held criminally accountable. The physical cause of the Hard Rock Hotel collapse centers on the steel structure itself, specifically the bolt connections that were supposed to hold the building's structural steel together. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, opened an investigation into the collapse, and that investigation concluded in March 2020, roughly 5 months after the building came down. The findings were direct. OSHA cited the project's lead engineer, Heaslip Engineering, for both willful and serious violations. The specific failure identified was a failure to adequately design, review, or approve the steel bolt connections that affected the structural integrity of the building. This is not a description of a material defect. Steel does not spontaneously fail without a load path problem. This is a description of a paperwork and process failure, a breakdown in the engineering verification chain that exists specifically to catch this kind of problem before construction proceeds, not after. In a properly functioning project, structural connections are designed, then independently reviewed, then approved, then built. Each step is a checkpoint. OSHA's finding says that this checkpoint sequence did not function as intended on this project. The distinction between the violations matters. A serious violation acknowledges a hazard existed that the employer knew or should have known about. A willful violation is different. It signals that OSHA determined the failure was not simply an oversight, but a disregard for a known requirement. When OSHA fines totaled $315,536, they were not spread evenly. Over $150,000 of that total was directed specifically at Heaslip Engineering, the lead engineer. The remaining amount, over $160,000, was distributed among 10 other companies attached to the project, including the general contractor, Citadel Builders, and the steel contractor, Suncoast Projects. This distribution tells its own story. The regulatory body, investigating the collapse, determined that the concentration of fault sat most heavily with the engineering firm responsible for the connection design and review, while a wider circle of contractors and subcontractors also bore some responsibility. An 18-story building does not get built without dozens of companies touching some part of the process. The fine structure reflects an attempt to draw a line through that web and identify where the critical failure actually occurred, at the design and review stage of the steel connections, before a single beam should have gone up. Understanding why this failure happened requires looking past the physical steel and into the institutional aftermath, because the record left behind shows a project and a city grappling with costs that extended far beyond the original $85 million construction budget. In the immediate aftermath of the collapse, the city of New Orleans faced emergency response costs of approximately $400,000 per day. That is not a one-time cost. That is a daily figure, accumulating for as long as the emergency response continued, covering the resources a city has to commit when a partially collapsed 18-story structure sits in the middle of a downtown corridor. A later lawsuit would claim that the total cost to taxpayers, cumulative over the entire response and recovery period, exceeded $12.3 million. That gap between the original construction budget and the eventual public cost of dealing with its failure is itself a measure of how a project's financial planning stopped at the point of construction and never accounted for what happens when the process fails. In August 2020, the city of New Orleans took formal legal action, filing a lawsuit against the developer, 1031 Canal LLC, owned by Mohan Kailas, along with more than a dozen contractors, engineers, and insurers connected to the project. The lawsuit represents the city's attempt to recover the costs it says it should never have had to bear, redirecting the financial burden of the failure back onto the companies and individuals the city holds responsible for it. But financial accountability and criminal accountability are separate tracks, and the criminal track tells a story about time running out. In October 2021, New Orleans District Attorney Jason Williams opened a criminal investigation into the collapse. That investigation operated under a 4-year window established by state law, the legal timeframe within which prosecutors could pursue gross negligence charges connected to the collapse. 2 years later, in October 2023, a grand jury returned a no true bill verdict, meaning it found insufficient evidence to support criminal charges. The district attorney's office was explicit about why. They cited a lack of cooperation from OSHA, the very federal agency whose own investigation had identified the willful and serious violations, as a hindrance to building the criminal case. The root failure here is not just an engineering decision made years earlier. It is a fractured accountability structure, where the agency that found the violation and the office trying to prosecute it were not aligned, and where a 4-year statutory clock ran out before that gap could be closed. The human toll of this collapse begins with the 3 workers killed and the approximately 30 others injured on October 12, 2019. People who were on that job site doing construction work on a building that was, at the moment of collapse, not structurally sound in the way its design was supposed to guarantee. Every fine, every lawsuit, every investigation that followed traces back to that immediate human cost, and none of the institutional response that came after could undo what happened in those early morning hours. But the consequences did not end with the collapse itself. For months afterward, 2 construction cranes remained embedded in the collapsed structure, a visible physical reminder standing over downtown New Orleans of what had happened. These cranes could not simply be dismantled by hand. The safety risk of manual dismantlement was judged too great, given the unstable state of the structure they were lodged in. The solution was to demolish them, and ultimately the building around them, through controlled explosion, a decision that itself reflects how far outside normal construction practice this project had moved. A building meant to open as a functioning hotel, instead, required a demolition plan more associated with catastrophic failure than construction completion. For the city of New Orleans, the consequence extended into daily operations and long-term liability. The $400,000 per day emergency response cost was not an abstraction. It represented city resources, personnel, and attention redirected away from other priorities and toward managing a crisis created by a private construction project. When that cost accumulated past $12.3 million, according to the city's own lawsuit, it represented a direct transfer of financial burden from the companies responsible for the building to the taxpayers of New Orleans, at least until and unless the lawsuit succeeded in recovering those funds. And for the families of the 3 workers killed and the roughly 30 injured, the eventual outcome of the criminal investigation added another layer of consequence. In October 2023, after a 4-year window and a formal investigation opened by the district attorney, a grand jury found insufficient evidence to bring criminal charges. No individual or company was criminally held responsible for the deaths and injuries that occurred that night. The OSHA fines totaling $315,536 represent the only quantified regulatory penalty tied directly to the willful and serious violations identified in the collapse, a civil and administrative consequence, not a criminal one. For a project that killed 3 people and injured 30, the final accounting was a lawsuit still working through the courts, and a criminal case that closed without charges. Today, the site at 1031 Canal Street sits cleared. After the 2 embedded cranes were demolished through controlled explosion and the remaining structure was brought down, the project site was cleared. As of reporting, no redevelopment has been announced for the location. There is no new hotel, no announced replacement project, no timeline for what comes next at the address where an $85 million construction effort once stood 18 stories into the New Orleans skyline. What remains instead is a paper trail spanning more than 4 years. An OSHA investigation that concluded in March 2020, identifying willful and serious violations in the design, review, and approval of steel bolt connections, centered on Heaslip Engineering, the project's lead engineer. Fines totaling $315,536, split between that engineering firm and 10 other companies including general contractor Citadel Builders and steel contractor Suncoast Projects. A city lawsuit filed in August 2020 against developer 1031 Canal LLC, owner Mohan Kailas, and more than a dozen contractors, engineers, and insurers, seeking to recover costs the city claims exceeded $12.3 million. And a criminal investigation opened in October 2021 by District Attorney Jason Williams, operating within a 4-year statutory window, that ended in October 2023 with a grand jury declining to indict anyone, citing insufficient evidence and pointing specifically to a lack of cooperation from OSHA as an obstacle. Each piece of that record represents a different system attempting, after the fact, to establish what went wrong and who should answer for it. The regulatory system, through OSHA, identified a specific technical failure and issued financial penalties. The civil legal system, through the city's lawsuit, is still pursuing financial recovery on behalf of taxpayers. The criminal legal system, through the district attorney's office, tried and failed to establish grounds for prosecution within the time the law allowed. 3 systems, 3 different outcomes, and only one of them, the regulatory fine, reached a definitive conclusion naming a specific cause: a failure to properly design, review, and approve the steel connections that were supposed to hold an 18-story building together. 3 workers died. Roughly 30 more were injured. A building that was meant to open as a hotel came down instead, and years later, the ground where it stood remains empty, its future undecided, while the questions about who should have been held criminally responsible remain formally unresolved.